Julia Collins was living the American dream. A beautiful home in the suburbs, a loving husband, a lifestyle many could only dream of. Her husband, Thomas Collins, a successful entrepreneur, worked long hours, providing everything she could ever want. On the surface, it seemed like the perfect life. But behind the walls of this picture-perfect home, Julia was becoming restless. The hours stretched long as Thomas was often away, consumed by his business dealings. Julia, a stay-at-home wife, found herself yearning for more. The monotony of suburban life began to feel suffocating. Her role as the doting wife was no longer enough to satisfy the hunger inside her. She wanted excitement, passion, the kind that her husband, busy with work, no longer seemed able to provide. Julia's world, once filled with luxury, was now tainted by a troubling sense of dissatisfaction. Her conversations with friends became filled with subtle hints of frustration. She felt isolated, ignored by her husband. And it was this loneliness, this longing for something more, that led her down a dark and dangerous path. She wasn't the first woman to feel the pull of desire when neglected by her spouse, and she wouldn't be the last. But Julia's decision to seek out that forbidden pleasure changed everything. Julia had heard stories of African men, strong, passionate, intense, the kind of men who could satisfy a woman in ways her husband no longer could. Her curiosity began to grow. She wondered if the rumors were true, if the wild tales she'd heard could fulfill the cravings she had long suppressed. It was in this space, at the edge of desire, that Julia made a decision that would alter her life and the lives of everyone around her, forever. Kofi, an African immigrant hired to clean the Collins household, a man who seemed quiet, humble, yet possessed an undeniable presence. He wasn't there to stay, just a temporary worker hired to take care of the house while Thomas was away on business. But Kofi had an aura, a quiet strength, and Julia, intrigued by his physical presence, began to take notice. From the moment they spoke, there was something unspoken between them, a chemistry that neither could ignore. Their first conversations were innocent enough, small talk about cleaning schedules, household tasks, but over time, something shifted. There was more than just pleasantries in their exchanges. Subtle intimacy began to creep in, a tension that neither could deny. Julia's curiosity about Kofi's background deepened. She found herself drawn to him, to the way he moved through her home, the way he carried himself. She was no longer just interested in his cleaning skills. It wasn't long before Julia began to entertain thoughts that would change the course of her life. Kofi, with his quiet confidence, seemed to awaken something deep inside her, something primal, something she thought was long buried. Julia's curiosity about Kofi's reputation quickly turned into an obsession. Her longing for passion, for excitement consumed her. Kofi didn't know it yet, but he was becoming the object of Julia's darkest desires. A secret affair was looming, one that would shatter not only Julia's marriage, but also Kofi's quiet life, and maybe his stay in the United States. Julia's affair with Kofi grew bolder by the day. With each stolen kiss, every secret meeting, the lines between right and wrong blurred, and Julia found herself further entangled in a dangerous game. Her obsession took control of her every thought, every action. In the dark hours of the night, Julia and Kofi would meet in secret, away from prying eyes. Their encounters were intense, passionate, and reckless. Julia's guilt would come in waves, but then she had always longed to experience that ecstasy and intense strength. The power Kofi had over her was undeniable, and she was unable to resist him. Her marriage, her life, everything she thought she had began to fade into the background as her world became centered on this affair. Kofi, however, was not just a lover to Julia. What she failed to see in the heat of passion was that Kofi had his own agenda. While Julia was consumed by lust and longing, Kofi's involvement in her life was far more calculated. He was not the man Julia believed him to be. His past, hidden behind the charm and attraction, held a darkness she never could have imagined. As the affair continued, Julia became more reckless. She would sneak around, hiding messages, deleting evidence, doing anything she could to keep her secret from Thomas. But as time went on, it became an addiction she couldn't quit. She couldn't escape the power Kofi had over her, and with each meeting, it was clear that the stakes were getting higher. The passion they shared in those stolen moments was intoxicating. Julia became someone else when she was with Kofi, free from the constraints of her marriage, unburdened by the reality of her situation. But as Julia lost herself to the affair, Kofi remained distant. Julia, blinded by her desire, failed to see the warning signs. Kofi wasn't just a man caught in a passionate love affair. He was a man with a past, and one that Julia was unknowingly dragging herself deeper into. As Julia's relationship with Kofi grew stronger, the signs of trouble began to emerge. Kofi's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He became possessive, demanding. What was once passionate and free now had an edge of danger to it. Julia, however, was too caught up in the affair to see the danger. Kofi's demands became more insistent. He wanted more than just her body. He wanted control. Kofi's manipulative side emerged slowly but surely. He began to use Julia's emotional vulnerability against her. He made several demands that had Julia send a huge part of her husband's money to Kofi's foreign account, and Julia, lost in her obsession, became more and more dependent on Kofi. Julia's growing obsession wasn't just limited to Kofi. It began to spill over into every aspect of her life. She found herself lying more often, staying out late, making excuses. She didn't even want to stop. She felt more pleased by the cleaner than her husband. It became intoxicating. But Kofi's increasing demands made her feel trapped, caught in a web she couldn't escape. Meanwhile, in the shadows, Thomas began to notice the change in Julia. Her behavior had become erratic. She was distant, distracted, and increasingly absent. The late nights, the nervous glances, the sudden secrecy, it all added up. Thomas was no fool. He loved his wife, but he knew something was wrong. What he didn't know was just how deep Julia's betrayal went, and just how dangerous it had become. Thomas, suspecting something wasn't right, began his own investigation. He went through Julia's things, her phone, her messages, her emails. What he uncovered shook him to his core. Evidence of the affair was everywhere. He found photos of Julia and Kofi together, hidden messages, texts that detailed the passion and secrecy of their relationship. He also found that his wife had been sending some huge amount of money to Kofi's foreign bank account. But what really shocked him more was the discovery of Kofi's criminal history. As Thomas dug deeper, he uncovered the dark truth about Kofi's past. The man who had come into their home, the man who had captured Julia's heart, was far more dangerous than Thomas could have imagined. Julia's secret was no longer a secret. The affair had escalated beyond what anyone could have anticipated, and the consequences of her actions were about to come crashing down in ways no one was prepared for. The tension between Thomas and Kofi had been growing steadily as suspicions turned into confrontations. What had started as a quiet, simmering jealousy in Thomas quickly evolved into a boiling point he couldn't ignore any longer. The truth, hidden beneath layers of lies and deceit, could no longer be kept at bay. Thomas knew something had to be done. He couldn't sit idly by any longer, watching his wife spiral deeper into a toxic relationship. Julia's actions had left him with no other choice. His suspicions about Kofi's influence on her had reached a breaking point. The man who had once been a mere stranger, an employee in their home, had become the third destructive force in their marriage. That very evening, Thomas confronted Kofi. The words exchanged were loaded with the weight of weeks of suspicion and growing tension. It went from a calm, confrontational conversation and then escalated quickly. Thomas's anger flared as Kofi, with his usual cold manner, fired back. At first, it was just shouting, a battle of words. But when Thomas accused Kofi outright, the situation spiraled out of control. Kofi, his eyes flashing with fury, stepped forward. The argument became more heated, each man pushing the other's buttons, their voices rising in volume. But then, something shifted. Kofi snapped. His usual calm, composed nature shattered in an instant. The anger that had been building up within him for weeks finally boiled over, and in a moment of unrestrained violence, Kofi struck Thomas. The confrontation quickly turned physical. It became a brutal, unrelenting fight. The violence was instant. Kofi overpowered Thomas. The struggle was desperate, the sounds of the clash echoing through the house. Within moments, Thomas's body lay lifeless on the floor. Don't you think that Thomas could have just called the police? His death would have been averted. As the violence subsided, Kofi stood over Thomas's body, breathing heavily, his eyes wild with the aftermath of his actions. It was a moment that would haunt him, but one that he would not regret. The deed was done. Thomas, the man who had stood between him and everything he wanted, was gone. When the authorities arrived at the scene, they were met with the gruesome reality of what had transpired. Neighbors were in shock, unable to believe what had just unfolded in their quiet neighborhood. Thomas, a man who had been loved and respected, was dead. The house was a scene of chaos, blood staining the floors, a body lying in the center of it all. The investigators moved quickly, gathering evidence, speaking with witnesses, and processing the crime scene. It was clear that what had started as a simple confrontation had turned into something far darker. But even as they pieced together the physical evidence, they began to realize that this wasn't just a crime of passion. It was the culmination of a long series of lies, deceit, and obsession. Julia's affair with Kofi had led to a devastating end, but the secrets that would come to light in the days that followed were even far more complex. The shockwave of the murder rippled through the community. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, struggling to understand what had happened. Many couldn't reconcile the man they had known as Thomas with the violent end he had met. And they certainly couldn't understand how Julia had become involved in something so dark. The story was far from over. Julia's involvement in Thomas's murder was undeniable. She had been the catalyst that set the entire chain of events in motion. Her affair with Kofi, her refusal to end it despite the mounting consequences, had pushed Thomas to his breaking point. But the investigation into the murder didn't stop with her. As investigators dug deeper into the case, they uncovered a trail of secrets that led them to the truth about Julia's motivations, Kofi's dangerous past, and the devastating impact of their affair. Julia, who had once seemed so innocent, was now at the center of a web of lies and manipulation that would unravel with each new revelation. Julia was brought in for questioning. At first, she denied everything, her emotions shifting between guilt, anger, and confusion. She claimed she had no idea that Kofi had killed Thomas. She insisted that Kofi had acted alone, that the violence was not something she had anticipated. But as the investigation progressed, the truth began to surface. It stunned everyone to hear that Julia had always fantasized about having a taste of the African's strength on the bed. In the weeks leading up to Thomas's death, Julia's behavior had been erratic. Her affair with Kofi had consumed her, pushing her to the edge. She had lied to her husband, lied to herself, and now, in the face of Thomas's murder, she was lying to the police. But as the evidence against Kofi piled up, it became clear that Julia's actions were not just those of a betrayed wife. She had played a significant role in the tragedy. Criminal profiler Dr. Elena Fisher, who was brought in to analyze Julia's behavior, spoke candidly about the psychological motivations behind her actions. Julia was caught in the grip of obsession, Dr. Fisher explained. The affair, at first a secret indulgence, became a consuming force. Her guilt was overshadowed by her desire to maintain control over a situation that was quickly spiraling out of her grasp. She didn't just cheat on her husband. She became emotionally entangled with Kofi in a way that blinded her to the consequences. Her obsession clouded her judgment, and ultimately, she betrayed both her husband and her own sense of morality. He also found out how Julia had been sending Thomas's money to Kofi's foreign bank account. Dr. Fisher continued, emphasizing that Julia's inability to escape the affair led her to make reckless decisions that put everyone at risk. Her actions weren't just about the affair. They were about a deep-seated need for excitement, validation, and control. Julia couldn't see the danger she was in, and by the time she realized the true cost of her choices, it was too late. As the investigation continued, authorities uncovered even more chilling details about Kofi's past, his ties to dangerous criminal organizations, his violent tendencies, and the web of lies he had spun around Julia. Kofi's charm and manipulation had led Julia to believe he was someone he wasn't. His true intentions, however, had always been far darker. The murder, in the end, was not just the tragic consequence of a love affair gone wrong. It was the result of years of deception, manipulation, and the psychological toll of obsession. Kofi had set the stage, and Julia had played her part, but it was the ultimate betrayal, of trust, of love, and of morality that led to Thomas's violent death. As the case progressed, the full weight of Julia's role in the crime became undeniable. She had known about Kofi's dangerous nature, but her obsession with him had clouded her judgment, and now she was left to face the consequences of her actions. A life shattered, a man dead, and the truth finally coming to light. The aftermath of Thomas's murder was felt far beyond the walls of their home. Julia, the woman who had everything, status, wealth, and a family, found herself facing the stark reality of what her actions had wrought. The choices she had made, fueled by her obsession with Kofi, had brought everything crashing down around her. As the police wrapped up their investigation and the house, once filled with life, stood silent, the weight of what had occurred seemed unbearable. Why did Julia allow things to get to this point? Was the fleeting thrill of her affair worth the devastating price she would now pay? The loss of Thomas was not only the end of his life, but the end of the life they had built together. The house, the relationships, and even Julia's sense of self had been shattered. No amount of wealth or success could undo the destruction that had been set into motion by a single, dangerous obsession. Infidelity, at its core, is about betrayal, but when obsession enters the equation, the consequences are no longer just about broken trust. The obsession clouds judgment, blurs the line between right and wrong, and often leads to irreversible actions. This wasn't just an affair. It was a psychological unraveling that ended in tragedy. What's most haunting about this story is that it wasn't a sudden, impulsive act. It was as if the perpetrator had longed for a day like that. Kofi was eventually convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison, while Julia, who had a hand in all of these, was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The consequences of this tragic affair would echo through their lives forever, as the shadows of what happened loomed over them. If this story moves you, make sure to subscribe to stay updated on similar stories. The truth can be deadly, and we're here to share it with you.